In 1914, Europe was at the peak of its power. The great powers had built global empires and armies larger and more powerful than any in history, and that summer they would turn them against each other. Each expected to triumph over its enemies in a short, victorious war, but instead, 1914 dragged them into an abyss with no end in sight. In the decades before the First World War broke out in 1914, industrialization led to huge increases in wealth and urbanization, but also created stark inequalities in society. Ruling groups needed to manage the resulting tensions, so encouraging nationalism and pride in imperial expansion helped to channel the anger and energy of the popular classes elsewhere. But this caused problems abroad. Britain, France, and Russia had well-established empires by the late 1800s when a new player arrived on the scene. Germany became a unified state in 1871 and eventually began to create its own overseas empire and blue water navy to appease its growing commercial class and to offset the powerful influence of social democratic parties at home. Germany's ambitions for its, quote, place in the sun caused a spike in tensions between the great powers, who were already in competition with each other. Great power rivalries became part of popular culture with jingoistic press, militaristic education in schools, and everything from children's toys and thriller novels, and even movies focusing on feats of arms or dangerous potential enemies. These political and social tensions caused a growing anxiety among many Europeans, and the danger that they might lead to war was heightened by increasing militarization. As the great powers expanded their empires and worried about rivals, they also built up their military capability and political alliances. Germany's expansion and naval buildup provoked reactions from the other powers. The UK responded by building even more warships, including the new Dreadnought class. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary and Russia clashed over influence in the Balkans, where new independent states had largely replaced the weakened Ottoman Empire with Russian help. By 1914, a system of alliances bound most of the great powers to each other, for better or for worse. France and Russia had been allies since 1894, and the Triple Alliance connected Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Britain had maintained a policy of splendid isolation for most of the 19th century, but its fear of German naval expansion brought it closer to the Franco-Russian bloc to create the Triple Entente. The danger of such alliances was that a conflict involving one or two powers was more likely to drag all of them into a European war. Germany felt surrounded by potential enemies, so it tried to test Entente resolve during two diplomatic crises in Morocco in 1905 and 1911. The British and French held firm, but there was no war, which angered German Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke. If we again slip away from this Moroccan affair with our tail between our legs, and if we cannot bring ourselves to put forward a determined claim which we are prepared to force through with the sword, I shall despair of the future of the German Empire. I shall then resign, but before handing in my resignation, I shall move to abolish the army and to place ourselves under Japanese protectorate. We shall then be in a position to make money without interference and develop into ninnies. Germany's worries about its situation in Europe caused its government to shift priority from the navy, which had angered Britain, back to the army, which caused France and Russia to expand their armies. To many in Berlin, it seemed that time was on the Entente's side, and Germany's chances would be better if war came sooner rather than later. Historians still debate whether Germany's assertiveness or Franco-British refusal to share international power played a greater role in increasing tensions. While great power alliances hardened across Europe, more trouble was brewing in the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia from the Ottomans in 1908 upset Russia and angered Serbian nationalists, who wanted closer ties with South Slav populations in Austria-Hungary. Russia then supported the independent Slav states in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in which Serbia gained more territory. Tensions between Austria-Hungary and Russia rose sharply over the Serb issue and got even worse when Austrian counterintelligence officer Alfred Riedel was exposed as a Russian spy in 1913. Long-term causes of the war, like imperial competition or military alliances, didn't mean that war was inevitable. For a full-on war to break out, a crisis had to come that would force governments to decide for war. On June 28, 1914, South Slav nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. Those shots triggered the July crisis. Following the killings, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Most historians agree today there was some semi-official Serbian involvement in the crime, although whether Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pasic and the rest of his government knew about the plot is hotly debated. In any case, in 1914, there was no proof of Serbian government involvement. The assassination itself did not bring about war directly. Austria-Hungary was disappointed that other European governments did not condemn the killings more forcefully, a view shared by the German ambassador to Russia, Friedrich von Portales. Not only in the press, but also in society, one meets almost only with unfriendly judgments on the murdered Archduke. But the Serbian response was the one that mattered most to Austria-Hungary. Officially, Pasic issued condolences, but also claimed that the assassinations were an internal Austro-Hungarian issue. The Serbian investigation lasted only a week and found no evidence of government involvement. Serb nationalists and newspapers were less diplomatic. Some openly blamed the Austro-Hungarians themselves for the killings, while others praised the assassins. When the Austro-Hungarians complained, Pasic said that he had neither the tools nor the inclination to censor the free Serbian press. Back in Vienna, the Imperial Council met to discuss their options. Chief of Staff Franz Konrad von Hötzendorf had argued forcefully for war for years, and he wasn't alone. The Foreign Ministry was flooded with letters from Austro-Hungarian notables calling for an armed response. Von Storch wrote on June 30th. Last year, I took the liberty of writing to say that we would have to learn how to tolerate Serbian impertinences without resorting to war. Now, the matter has acquired an entirely different aspect. Konrad put it more bluntly. War, war, war. The Austrian government decided on a military response to punish Serbia and resolve the issue of greater Serb nationalism seen to be destabilizing the empire. The war was meant to be local and quick. But attacking Serbia meant risking conflict with Russia, and for Austria, that was unthinkable without Germany's support. After the assassinations, the German ambassador to Vienna had urged restraint, but on July 6th, Kaiser Wilhelm made Germany's position clear by giving Austria the so-called blank check. Austrian ambassador Count Laszlo Szögyeni-Marich reported the German promise to Vienna. The Kaiser authorized me to inform our gracious Majesty that we might rely upon Germany's full support. If we had really recognized the necessity of warlike action against Serbia, Kaiser Wilhelm would regret if we did not make use of the present moment, which is all in our favor. Wilhelm went on to say that he felt that Russia was not ready for war, and if Austria did attack Serbia, it should do so as quickly as possible. So by early July, 4 outcomes seemed possible. A peaceful negotiated settlement, an Austro-Serbian war in the Balkans, a continental war involving Austria, Russia, Germany, and probably France, or a world war if Britain and its empire joined France and Russia. Only Austria-Hungary and Russia had direct interests in the Balkans, but the system of European alliances would likely draw other states in as well. However, neither the Triple Alliance nor the Triple Entente called for automatic participation in a war. Instead, each state had to decide how far they were willing to go. The Triple Entente powers generally preferred a negotiated settlement to the crisis. If war did break out, Britain and France favored limiting the war to the Balkans, although Russia was more willing to accept a great power war over Serbia. Russia wanted to keep its reputation as protector of the Balkan Slavs and potentially expand its influence in the area around the Turkish Straits that were so important to Russian trade and power projection. If it came to a great power war, France would support its ally in Russia and hope that Britain would join as well. In Britain, a major war was unpopular with the public, business circles, and some members of cabinet. Some politicians, like Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, reasoned that if a major war broke out, the outcome would be better for Britain if it joined Russia and France. If Germany and Austria defeated France and Russia, British interests and security would badly suffer, but there was still significant opposition in the UK. As far as the Entente powers were concerned, a major war still seemed unlikely. Understanding Austro-German intentions is trickier, and historians still debate them. Their leaders saw little benefit in a negotiated settlement. It wouldn't resolve the issue of Serbian nationalism or improve Austria's position in the Balkans. The best outcome would probably come from a localized Austro-Serbian war. At the same time, launching such a war meant accepting the risk of a continental war against France and Russia and possibly Britain. Germany had made plans for war against France and Russia and felt that the longer it waited, the more powerful Russia would become and the greater the risk of defeat. Germany and Austria both decided to risk a European war against France and Russia to resolve the Serbian issue in Austria's favor. If a general war came, victory would allow Germany to dominate the continent. The wild card, of course, was Britain. If the UK fought against them, an Austro-German victory was much less likely and would amount to a worst-case scenario. So in the face of rival alliances and conflicting goals and expectations, the great powers of Europe faced the July crisis of 1914. After Germany's blank check to Austria on July 6th, Austria-Hungary planned to move quickly against Serbia, but that was easier said than done. On July 7th, the Austro-Hungarians planned their next step. Although many were eager for war, the government was not quite united. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza was at first hesitant. The Kingdom of Hungary already included many Serbs, and war with Serbia would only increase those tensions. Tisza insisted that Austria-Hungary deliver an ultimatum to Serbia to give one last opportunity for peace, or to justify eventual military action. Crafting the ultimatum took time, and Tisza only approved the final text on July 19th. The ultimatum text was not the only delay. Many Austro-Hungarian troops were on leave for the harvest, and mobilization would take 2 weeks. Internationally, the French President and Prime Minister arrived in St. Petersburg on July 20th for a scheduled meeting with the Russians, so if the Austrians gave the ultimatum to Serbia before the French went home, Moscow and Paris might quickly develop a joint response. It's debated how much the French and Russians may have already known about the coming Austrian ultimatum, but they did use the meeting to portray an image of ironclad unity. As President Raymond Poincaré told the Russians, his primary concern was Britain. "We shall have weighty matters to discuss. I am sure we shall agree on all points, but there is one question which is very much on my mind: our understanding with England. We must get her to come into our alliance." The Austro-Hungarians waited until the French leaders were at sea on July 23rd to send the ultimatum to the Serbs. Of the 10 demands, most concerned the arrest of Serbian officials and the suppression of anti-Habsburg propaganda. To carry this out, the ultimatum demanded that Serbia, quote, accept the collaboration in Serbia of organs of the imperial and royal government of Austria-Hungary. This was tantamount to surrendering Serbian sovereignty, and the Austrians had deliberately drafted the ultimatum so the Serbs would have no choice but to reject it, and war could then be declared. Belgrade replied within the 48-hour deadline and accepted all the points except for those contrary to the Serbian constitution, like allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to prosecute Serbian citizens. The ultimatum triggered a wave of feverish diplomatic activity. The Entente powers now fully realized the seriousness of the crisis, which had mostly been driven behind closed doors in Vienna and Berlin until now. London, Paris, and St. Petersburg condemned the ultimatum, although Britain suggested mediation talks including Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. But Berlin refused. Russo-Austrian relations were by now red hot. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov actually shouted at the Austro-Hungarian ambassador in a meeting. "I know what it is. You want to make war on Serbia. The German newspapers have been egging you on. You are setting fire to Europe. It's a great responsibility you are taking on. You will see what effect this has in London and Paris, and maybe elsewhere too. The Tsar ordered partial mobilization of 4 military districts on July 24th, followed by the period preparatory to war on the 26th. The Russian army began to call up reservists, gather supplies, and promote officers. At the same time, the Tsar wanted to make sure that these measures did not appear to be directed at Germany. So Austria-Hungary had a blank check from Germany and had made sure that its ultimatum to Serbia was unacceptable. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The war was still a regional one, but that would all change in the cascade of events in the coming days. In reality, partial Russian mobilization was an illusion. The General Staff had no plans to partially mobilize, and Tsar Nicholas's generals told him that partial mobilization would disrupt a potential full mobilization and still likely alarm the Germans. Military and political leaders of all powers were confronted with the same problem. If one army mobilized, its neighbor would feel pressure to do the same or run the risk of an early defeat thanks to modern railways bringing enemy troops to the border within days. This dilemma gave the generals increased influence over the crisis. On July 30th, after overcoming the last-minute nerves, the Tsar announced full mobilization. All eyes now turned to Germany. From July 29th to August 1st, Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm exchanged a series of urgent telegrams. Affectionately signing Nicky or Willy, the two cousins spoke of their affection for each other, but also issued demands. On July 30th, Willy wrote to Nicky, "I now receive authentic news of serious preparations for war on my eastern frontier. Responsibility for the safety of my empire forces preventive measures of defense upon me. My friendship for you and your empire, transmitted to me by my grandfather on his deathbed, has always been sacred to me, and I have honestly often backed up Russia. The peace of Europe may still be maintained by you if Russia will agree to stop the military measures which must threaten Germany and Austria-Hungary." London now tried to mediate again, including a proposal for Austro-Hungarian forces to stop at Belgrade. On the 29th, German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg asked Britain to stay neutral if Germany promised not to touch French possessions. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey now desperately sought clarification from his own cabinet, 2/3 of which had previously opposed the war. Cabinet member John Burns summed up the decision. Situation seriously reviewed from all points of view. It was decided not to decide. Britain still would not say if it would join the Entente in case of a general war. Hollweg was now unsure of British intentions and tried to rein in the Austro-Hungarians, including suggesting the Halt in Belgrade plan. Meanwhile, the German Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke was encouraging Conrad to attack. This led to Conrad explaining, "Who actually rules in Berlin, Bethmann or Moltke?" But the Austro-Hungarians claimed it was now too late to change course, and a temporary occupation of Belgrade would not achieve their aims. Moltke also began to push for Germany to mobilize, since the German war plan depended on speed to avoid a two-front war. The Schlieffen Plan called for German armies to first defeat France while Russia was still mobilizing, then shift the German troops to the east. If Russia was allowed to mobilize first, Germany would be at a disadvantage. The Germans had started preparing on July 28th, but on the 31st, Kaiser Wilhelm announced pre-mobilization, the Kriegsgefahrzustand, or state of threatening danger of war. The decision led to another flurry of telegrams. Germany demanded that Russia cease mobilization, while simultaneously asking Austria-Hungary to prepare for operations against Russia. The Germans also asked for French and British neutrality in a seemingly imminent Russo-German war. In Britain, a third royal cousin, King George, now called on the Tsar to end mobilization. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith recalled the moment he presented a draft telegram to the king. The poor king was hauled from his bed, and one of my strangest experiences was sitting with him. I read the message and the proposed answer. All he did was suggest that it should be made more personal and direct, by the insertion of the words, "My dear Nicky," and the addition at the end of the signature, "Georgie." And so, as July 1914 came to an end, there was a frenzy of diplomatic messages between European capitals. For many military leaders, though, it was too late for any more talk, and they began to pressure the politicians to act. On July 31st, French General Joseph Joffre asked his government to reverse its more passive policy and mobilize. President Poincaré described the meeting, which lasted into the wee hours of August 1st. Joffre appeared with the placid face of a calm, resolute man whose only fear is lest France, outstripped by German mobilization, the most rapid of them all, might speedily find herself in an irreparable state of inferiority. France finally mobilized at 4 p.m. on August 1st. In Berlin, Moltke was having the same conversation with Chancellor Hollweg, and 30 minutes later, Germany announced their mobilization. By 7 p.m., Moscow told Berlin that Russia would not stop its mobilization, and so Germany declared war on Russia. On August 2nd, German troops were on the move, not east but west into neutral Luxembourg. This was in accordance with the Schlieffen Plan, which the Germans said was a strategic necessity. The British position was still not clear. London sent ambiguous messages to Berlin suggesting that Britain might remain neutral if Germany did not attack France. Kaiser Wilhelm now asked Moltke to abandon the Schlieffen Plan and stop his armies from marching across the French border. Von Moltke replied that stopping the massive and complex mobilization was impossible and suicidal. The Kaiser was angry, and his answer showed that he did not fully understand his own military machine. Your illustrious uncle von Moltke the Elder would not have given me such an answer. If I order it, it must be possible. Soon after, the Kaiser learned that there was no formal British offer to stay neutral and gave his armies the green light to follow the plan and invade Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. By August 2nd, the mood in Britain had shifted towards intervention. The British informed the French that they would block any German naval movements in the Channel and would uphold Belgian neutrality. Belgian neutrality was Britain's final red line, but it was a line that Germany had already begun to cross. The same day, Germany delivered an ultimatum to Belgium that it had prepared back on July 26th. The Germans claimed the French planned to enter Belgium, so Germany had no choice but to move in preemptively. If Belgium resisted, the Germans would consider it an enemy. Brussels replied to Berlin on August 3rd. The intentions Germany ascribes to France are in contradiction with the formal declarations made to us. The infringement of Belgium's independence, with which the German governments threaten her, would constitute a flagrant violation of international law. No strategic interest justifies such a breach of law. The Belgian government is firmly resolved to repel every infringement of its rights by all means in its power. That same day, the final dominoes began to fall. Italy declared that it would stay neutral and would not join its Triple Alliance partners in war. Germany claimed France was about to attack it, which wasn't true, and declared war on France. On August 4th, German troops marched into Belgium. Belgium appealed to Britain, France, and Russia to guarantee her independence, and Britain declared war on Germany. By August 4th, the great powers of Europe were at war, and the First World War had begun. In the next 4 years, roughly 20 million people would be killed or die of disease and hunger. But even before the killing stopped, debates were raging about the war's origins and who was to blame, and they haven't stopped since. Shortly after the outbreak of the war, each of the powers published a so-called color book, making its case as to how to understand the July crisis and basically blaming the other side. After the war, each side still blamed the other, and the Allies put the responsibility squarely on the Central Powers in the post-war peace treaties. Since then, the evidence of 1914 has been interpreted in many different ways as historians have tried to answer who was at fault for starting the war. For years, many historians concluded that all the powers shared some of the blame for the war beginning. Then, in the 1960s, German historian Fritz Fischer made one of the most influential arguments. He claimed that the German government and military elites had grandiose plans and wanted to achieve them through war. The Fischer school claims Germany had long planned a war aimed against Russia and France and directly led Austro-Hungarian actions in order to escalate events. More recently, other single powers have been fingered for their role in the crisis. Sean McMeekin emphasized that Russia's actions turned a Balkan war into a continental one, and Niall Ferguson blamed Britain for its mistakes and naivete. Some other recent interpretations, like Christopher Clark's sleepwalker theory, suggest the war was largely unintended and resulted from miscalculations, misunderstandings, and perceived insecurities. He argues that Germany felt Russia and Britain were unlikely to become involved and tried its best to localize the conflict in the Balkans. Another debate centers around whether the war was inevitable. Here, the recent consensus is that the alliance system did not force any state to fight, as Italy proved by staying neutral in 1914. This line of thinking stresses that there were many times when things might have taken a different turn, like if Austria had acted more quickly against Serbia, or if Britain had taken a clear position right from the start of the crisis. There's also a discussion about culture and mentality in 1914. Historian James Joel, for example, suggests that the cultural, military, and strategic zeitgeist saw war as a practical and indeed desirable tool for social change and defense of national interests. Since modern war also involved the need for a quick mobilization via rail timetables, military commanders became as or even more important than politicians in the crisis. But their inflexible strategies could not respond to the political needs, so perceived military necessity dictated political action. Russian politicians wanted partial mobilization not to scare Germany, but did just that. And German politicians did not want to bring Britain into the war, but their armies marched into Belgium and did just that. This was the exact opposite of Clausewitz's concept that war is politics by other means. And it's an important aspect of understanding how the crisis ended in a world war. The war that started with the July crisis in 1914 lasted more than 4 years. But the war amongst historians to make sense of it all still rages more than a century later. But those future debates were far from the minds of the people of Europe in August 1914. Men from every city, town, and village rushed to their mobilization depots, troop trains sped towards the borders, and the armies marched towards the enemy in the hot summer sun. Many civilians and soldiers were caught up in a sort of war fever, nicknamed the Spirit of 1914 in Germany, fed by jingoistic headlines in the press and soon by organized government propaganda. Crowds gathered to see off the men, and women stuck flowers in the muzzles of their rifles, and in Austria-Hungary, people rioted against local Serbs. In Paris, angry citizens looted dairy shops thought to belong to a German company, but they were actually Swiss. But war enthusiasm was not as widespread as once believed. For millions, especially in rural areas, the war was met with uncertainty and dread. French military doctor Louis Maufray recalled the moment the news came to his village. Everyone stopped as though petrified. We understood. The women cried, the men, fixed to the sidewalk, looked at the clock tower as the bell tolled. When the chiming stopped, there was a deep silence. Some had also expected internationally minded socialists might stop a war with a general strike across the continent. But despite a few demonstrations, most socialist parties and unions sided with their governments. The German Social Democrats all voted for war credits, and French anti-war socialist leader Jean Jaurès was assassinated by a radical nationalist. His colleague Gustave Hervé rallied to the cause. Between Imperial Germany and Republican France, there's no hesitation. Our choice is made. Vive la France républicaine et socialiste. And so all the great powers of Europe went to war for the first time in a century. And once the armies met on the field of battle, the fears of those not cheering in the streets would be borne out. The German war plan, the Schlieffen or Schlieffen-Moltke plan, was to send most of their armies through neutral Belgium and then swing into France in a wide arc, passing west of Paris to encircle and crush the French within 6 weeks. Then German units could head east to deal with Russia, which would mobilize much more slowly. The plan ignored logistical limitations and probably required more men than Germany had, but the bulk of the 1.7 million German troops in the west marched into Belgium confident of victory. The Belgian army had just 100,000 men, far too small to stop the massive German force streaming across its borders, and they hadn't properly coordinated with the French and British due to their former neutrality. There were some important fortresses, especially around Liège and Namur, whose garrisons tried to hold up the German advance until French help could arrive. But the Germans brought up super heavy artillery, 420mm guns, and Austro-Hungarian 305mm siege mortars. Belgian General Gérard Leman was in command of the forts near Liège. When the big siege mortars entered into action, they hurled against us shells weighing 1,000 kilos, the explosive force of which surpasses anything known hitherto. I had hardly advanced a few feet in the gallery when a great blast passed by, and I was thrown violently to the ground. I managed to get up and continue on my way, only to be stopped by a choking cloud of poisonous fumes. Looking out of the peephole, I saw to my horror the fort had fallen. Slopes and counterslopes being a chaos of rubbish, while huge tongues of flame were shooting forth from the throat of the fortress. As the fighting raged around Liège, German officer Erich Ludendorff becomes a national hero for jumping in and taking command of a brigade in the midst of the battle. The Belgians fought as well as they could, but pulled back quickly, even though French and British troops entered Belgium to help. In conquered areas, German troops' fear of mostly imaginary francs-tireurs and a sense of impunity led them to kill some 5,500 Belgian civilians, and they will eventually execute 900 French civilians as well. Allied propagandists later used reports, real and exaggerated, of these atrocities to create the narrative of the rape of Belgium. The French High Command still didn't know the main German force was coming through Belgium, and the much smaller British Expeditionary Force and French Fifth Army run right into it. The Germans rolled them back, forcing Allied units to fight desperate delaying actions. The BEF briefly delayed the Germans at Mons on August 23rd, but the Germans outflanked the British and forced them to retreat. Captain William Moritz' unit never received the retreat order and was trapped. We decided to sell our lives dearly. I ordered my men to fix bayonets and charge, which the gallant fellows did splendidly, but we got shot down like 9 pins. As I loaded my revolver, I was hit in the right wrist. I'd not gone far when I got a bullet through the calf of my right leg, which brought me down. The Germans had a shot at me on the ground to finish me off. That shot hit my sword, which I wore on my side. This turned the bullet and saved my life. The rest of the BEF made another stand at Le Cateau on the 26th, while the French Fifth Army did the same at Guise on the 29th. And the BEF was so exhausted it didn't help them. The Germans pushed on at breakneck speed, and the Allied Great Retreat continued, not only for Allied soldiers, but Belgian and French civilians alongside them. One of the saddest sights of that day was the huge columns of refugees on the main road to Guise. Carts heaped with household treasures, led by crying women and frightened children. These carts were ruthlessly swept off the road to make a passage for the troops. This was absolutely necessary, of course, in spite of its cruelty. While the Allies were reeling in the north, along the Franco-German border, the French army sprang into action according to its Plan 17. French forces advanced into Germany and countered German moves with attacks in the Ardennes region. The result was the Battle of the Frontiers, a massive clash from August 14th to 24th. French infantry took the fight to the Germans, but often without enough artillery support and sometimes into prepared German positions. The result was slaughter. German artillery and machine guns mowed down Frenchmen in their tens of thousands. On August 22nd alone, around 21,000 French soldiers were killed. French Captain Ignard was among the wounded. The charge was hardly begun when it faltered under rapid fire at close range from the enemy sheltering behind earthworks. I could not see my number 2 section, and I looked back and saw that the number 3 and number 4 sections had not followed our advance. I set off immediately to the leading section, but I barely had time to go a few steps before I got a bullet that hammered into the top of my left arm. The shoulder was shattered, my arm hanging only by pieces of flesh. I fell, half fainting. The Germans had planned to allow the French to advance in the east to help them with their encirclement, but Crown Prince Ruprecht couldn't resist the chance to pursue the defeated enemy, and his formations pushed farther west than planned. This actually helped the French, who now realized the seriousness of the threat from the north. French commander General Joseph Joffre admitted Plan 17 had failed, sacked dozens of generals, and took the risk of shifting troops by rail in the midst of operations to counter the German threat to his left. Initially, he wanted to create a strike force near Amiens and hit the Germans in the flank, but the Germans were too fast. The new French 6th Army, raised in Paris and reinforced by units from the east, would protect the French capital and threaten the German flank along the Marne River, just 50 kilometers from Paris. The German advance became more and more menacing, and some in the German headquarters felt that the battle and the war had already been won. But in the field, the situation was getting more and more difficult for the Germans. Chief of the General Staff Helmut von Moltke was nervous. He gave conflicting orders and began to doubt. We have had success, but have not yet won. Victory is the destruction of enemy resistance. When million-man armies oppose one another, the victor takes prisoners. Where are our prisoners? The worst is yet to come. He ordered his two westernmost armies to pass east of Paris, and as they did, a gap opened up between them as they approached the Marne. French intelligence and aerial reconnaissance revealed the sudden change and the gap on September 3rd. In a dramatic meeting, Joffre convinced British commander Field Marshal John French to send the battered BEF into the line again and ordered a general offensive. The fate of the country depends on the coming battle. All our efforts must go towards attacking and repelling the enemy. Troops that can no longer advance must hold the ground they've conquered at any cost and be killed on the spot rather than retreating. In the present circumstances, no failure will be tolerated. The French threw everything they had into the Battle of the Marne from September 5th to 12th. They even brought a few thousand men to the front in civilian taxicabs, and the Allies outnumbered the Germans 1.1 million to 750,000, though the Germans had 3,300 guns to the Allies' 3,000. In many parts of the line, though, it seemed at first the Germans were getting the upper hand. French officer Paul Truffaut joined a failed attack. The men fix bayonets, a flag is unfurled. It's too late to get to my own regiment. I pick up a dead man's weapon, slip on a cartridge belt, and join the advancing troop. It's rather scattered and pushing forward in every direction, urged on by the bugles. What's that I'm stepping on? The dead and wounded, friends and foes. The Allies kept up the pressure. The BEF and part of the French Fifth Army pushed into the vulnerable gap between the German First and Second Armies, creating a crisis. For many German soldiers, French firepower was also taking its toll. I looked death in the eye 100 times yesterday. We're lying opposite an enemy with superior artillery, whom it is impossible to approach as he simply shoots our infantry to pieces. German headquarters was blinded by the fog of war. They didn't fully realize their tactical successes, but did know of the mortal threat posed by the Allied forces getting between their armies. Staff officer Colonel Hensch visited the army commanders, and in a much-debated episode, the Germans decided to retreat to the river Aisne. Moltke had a near breakdown and was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn. The Allies tried to pursue the Germans across the Aisne, but lacked the strength. France had been saved in what became known as the Miracle on the Marne. Some historians even argue this battle ensured Allied long-term victory in the war. There was much more fighting to come in France before 1914 was out, but the French had stopped the Germans at the Marne and ruined the German war plan. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungarian armies were on the march where the war began, in the Balkans. Austro-Hungarian planners faced a dilemma right from the start. At first, they were only at war with Serbia, but they couldn't send too many forces there for fear of war with Russia. Once Russia joined the war, it made sense to focus on the east, but politically they had to attack Serbia as well. The solution was a very awkward one. Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf had divided his forces in three: a small group for the Serbian front, a large group for the Russian front, and a medium-sized group, B echelon, that could be sent to either front. At first, Conrad sent B echelon to the Balkans, but he couldn't risk it getting actually bogged down since he needed to send it east as soon as possible. so it would play a temporary support role before getting back on the trains to head east. This meant the Austro-Hungarian attack into Serbia was rushed. General Oskar Potiorek, a rival of Conrad's, was keen for a victory that he could lay claim to, and his army of 140,000 men, 40% of whom were Serbs, Bosnians or Croats, had far more machine guns and artillery than the Serbs. The 200,000-strong Serbian army had experience from the recent Balkan Wars and modern French artillery, but they were short ammunition, machine guns and rifles. The Austro-Hungarian troops began the so-called Strafexpedition, or punitive expedition, on August 12th. Their advance from the west surprised the Serbs, but they immediately ran into logistical problems, heavy rain and extreme heat. The Serbian army had adopted a defensive position inland from the border, but Serbian irregulars called komitadžis harassed the Habsburg troops, who had orders to show no mercy. I command that during military operations, the utmost strictness, hardness, and distrust is to be shown to every Serb. If so much as one shot is taken at our troops in a village, civilians are to be eliminated. Any resident seen outside a village, or especially in a forest, is to be considered a bandit hiding weapons. If these people look halfway suspicious, they are to be eliminated. As they advanced, Austro-Hungarian troops massacred captured komitadžis, but also civilians, especially in the town of Šabac. Some estimate Austro-Hungarians executed up to 4,000 civilians in about 10 days, although the numbers are debated, in addition to burning down numerous villages. Serbian commander Radomir Putnik pivoted his army to the west and struck back on August 15th at the Battle of Cer Mountain. The Serbian night attack caught the tired Austro-Hungarians by surprise. After a quick burst of fire, the Serbs charge in dense lines with triumphant cries. The attack comes too unexpectedly for the troops, for whom this is the first experience of close combat. They defend themselves valiantly at some places, but at other points, some lose their nerve. After several days of desperate fighting, the Austro-Hungarians retreated and evacuated Serbian territory by August 24th. Some Serbian troops take revenge on surrendering Austro-Hungarians when they learned of the Habsburg atrocities. The first campaign of the First World War ended in a Serbian victory at the cost of 17,000 killed and wounded, while the Austro-Hungarians lost 20,000 killed and wounded and 4,500 prisoners. Serbian units then raided into Austrian Bosnia, but the population did not rise up against Vienna as Belgrade had hoped. So Serbia had won an unexpected victory against Austria-Hungary, but the stakes were far higher on the Russian front, and there both sides immediately went on the attack. The campaign in the east began with complications for the Austrians. There were no precise war plans coordinated with the Germans, and both sides assumed the other would move more troops to face the Russians than they actually did. Conrad wanted the Germans to attack out of East Prussia, but they refused. To make matters worse, Austrian mobilization had been slower than expected and Russian much faster. Deployment was also an issue, as Conrad's last-minute changes meant that troops detrained far from their jumping-off points and had to march tens of extra kilometers in the summer heat. Many reservists were exhausted before the campaign even began. The Russians also had more troops, 750,000 to 500,000, a lot more cavalry, and much more and better artillery, whose crews were trained in indirect fire thanks to the experience of the Russo-Japanese War. Still, Conrad launched a large-scale offensive north to threaten Russian Poland and the rear of Russian armies facing East Prussia. Meanwhile, Russian General Nikolai Ivanov planned to send the armies of his southwest front towards Austrian Lemberg and eventually Krakow. At first, the Austro-Hungarians were successful. On August 23rd, 24th, they pushed back the Russians at Krasnik thanks to determined infantry assaults, but took very heavy losses from the skilled Russian artillery. Still, General Viktor Dankl was confident. Russians are fleeing everywhere. Our troops were magnificent. The men are unstoppable. They charge at the enemy with unrelenting vigor. The Russians, as long as they do not outnumber us too heavily, are no match for us. It was a similar story at the Battle of Komarov a few days later, as the Austrians forced the Russians to retreat again. Exhausted Austrian troops, though, didn't have the numbers or the strength to complete the encirclement, and again paid a heavy price. The unrelenting cannonade turned the battlefield into a living hell. and the events of those terrible hours exceeded all previously held expectations of the war. Then Russia made its move. General Alexei Brusilov's 8th Army led the charge into eastern Galicia, smashing the overstretched Austrians at Gniwa Lipa in late August and taking Lemberg on September 3rd. They also attacked the northernmost Austrian armies, which had drifted apart, and defeated them at the Battle of Rava Ruska. A massive Austro-Hungarian counterattack failed to stop the enemy, so they withdrew deep into Habsburg territory, leaving the fortress of Przemyśl under Russian siege. Fresh Russian units and devastating use of artillery shattered the disorganized, exhausted, and thinly spread Austro-Hungarian formations. Order in the Habsburg units began to break down, as one Austro-Hungarian soldier recalled. Train convoys of all military branches blocked the streets for miles. All of the languages of the monarchy could be heard screeching in a wild cacophony of voices. The drivers struck each other with their whips, horse-mounted train commanders vented their frustration with repeated shots from their pistols. Hundreds of broken and bullet-ridden wagons lay in the ditches, alongside the bloated carcasses and the corpses of soldiers. As in Serbia, Habsburg defeat resulted in atrocities. The army suspected local Ukrainians of Russian sympathies and executed many as alleged spies. Estimates vary between 1,500 and 30,000. A later Austro-Hungarian report, though, found there was no widespread pro-Russian feeling or espionage amongst the Ukrainian population of East Galicia. By late September, Russia had captured Galicia and Bukovina, important oil fields, and the forts at Lemberg and Yaroslav. Austria-Hungary had suffered 320,000 killed and wounded and 100,000 prisoners. 100,000 more Habsburg soldiers were cut off at Przemyśl. Russian losses were heavy too, 210,000 killed and wounded and 40,000 prisoners. The difference was, Russia could afford such losses and Austria could not, especially its already small officer corps. Austria-Hungary's eastern offensive ended in defeat. In fact, Russia's Galicia offensive actually achieved its strategic aim of crippling the Habsburg armies. At the same time, though, the Russian offensive in East Prussia met a different fate. When war broke out, the Russian Empire hurried to mobilize and pressure Germany as soon as possible to help France. On August 17th, 2 Russian armies crossed the frontier into East Prussia, hoping to surround the smaller German forces and threaten Berlin. The Russian invasion force totaled 500,000 men and about 1,650 guns, while the Germans had just 200,000 men and 770 guns. But the Germans had the advantage of local rail lines and the Angarab defensive position based on several lakes, while the Russians had to advance over difficult terrain with poor roads and few supplies. The Russian armies were also separated by an area of thick forests and lakes, and its army commanders were at odds with their superior. As the Russian armies occupied German villages, the German press was full of wild rumors of atrocities. Most were exaggerated, but Russian troops did burn some small towns and villages and killed nearly 1,500 civilians, usually on unfounded suspicions of resistance or spying. This fired German ideas of Russian barbarism and helped push commanders to counterattack in haste on August 19th. Corps Commander General Hermann von François disobeyed orders and attacked the easternmost Russian army too quickly and without enough artillery support. The resulting Battle of Gumbinnen saw General Pavel Rennenkampf's army throw back the Germans. A Russian officer recalled the intensity of the battle. The fire we opened on the enemy all along the line was so precise and deliberate that the Germans, having suffered huge casualties, had to stop and drop to the ground. Many of them were killed here in these open attacks, as they advanced in columns, keeping tight formation. Then German aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts of uncoded Russian communications showed that the entire German position was under threat from General Alexander Samsonov's army in the south. German commander Maximilian von Prittwitz planned to give up all of East Prussia and retreat to the Vistula River. But the Army High Command removed him. They appointed Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff in his place and diverted an army corps from France. But the German 8th Army staff already had a battle plan. The Germans intercepted Rennenkampf's orders for his army not to press the advance, which meant that he would not link up with Samsonov. They quickly transferred units along the railway and launched a 2-pronged attack against the unsuspecting Samsonov on August 23rd. Confusion reigned in Russian lines, with the tired, hungry, and thirsty troops suddenly being driven back along the flanks. Samsonov misjudged the situation and ordered his army deeper into the trap. By the time the Russians realized what was happening, it was too late. By August 30th, Samsonov's army was completely destroyed. He shot himself, and the remnants withdrew across the border. German newspapers reported a dramatic account of the carnage. The sight of Russians driven into two huge lakes or swamps to drown was ghastly, and the shrieks and cries of the dying men and horses he will never forget. So fearful was the sight of these thousands of men with their guns, horses, and ammunition struggling in the water that, to shorten their agony, they turned the machine guns on them. But even in spite of that, there was movement seen among them for a week after. The Russians had lost 92,000 prisoners, 50,000 dead and wounded, and 500 guns, against German losses of just 15,000 killed and wounded. Ludendorff christened it the Battle of Tannenberg, historic revenge for the 1410 Battle of the Teutonic Knights that they lost against the Polish kingdom. The victory made the reputation of the two German commanders, and the myth of Tannenberg helped propel their military and later political careers. The Germans then turned their attention to Rennenkampf, who'd not advanced to help Samsonov. Trains rushed units back to the north, and the two corps from France finally arrived. During the Battle of the Masurian Lakes from September 5th to 13th, the German 8th Army defeated the Russians and forced them out of all but a tiny piece of East Prussia. Though this time, they don't destroy the Russian army, which even launched a successful local counterattack later in September before the front settled. By September, a month of titanic struggle in Eastern Europe had seen Serbia defeat Austria, Russia defeat Austria, and Germany defeat Russia. But none of these victories or defeats were decisive, and the powers continued to try to break the enemy. The Austrians, especially Potiorek, still hoped to crush Serbia. They attacked again in September and November but failed, then finally took Belgrade in early December. The Serbs, with fresh ammunition and weapons from France and Russia, struck back and retook their capital on December 15th, leaving the Balkan front in a stalemate and Serbia with tens of thousands of hungry, cold, and sick refugees it could barely care for. Farther east, the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German armies all attempted large-scale offensives in the fall and early winter of 1914. The Habsburg army briefly relieved the siege of Przemyśl in October before the Russians pushed them back again, and the Germans stopped another Russian invasion of East Prussia at Augustovo. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians advanced on Warsaw and nearly smashed the Russians before a Russian counterattack threw them back. Yet more German attacks resulted in the capture of Łódź in December. That same month, the Austro-Hungarians also managed to avoid another disaster by stopping a major Russian attack at the Battle of Limanova, keeping Russian forces away from Krakow and the Hungarian interior. These battles are relatively unknown today, but cost both sides hundreds of thousands of casualties and led to great suffering for millions of men fighting in wet and wintry conditions with a dramatic lack of artillery shells and other supplies. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the war on the Central Powers side in October opened up new fronts. The Sultan and Caliph declared a global jihad against the Allies, but it made little difference as the British took Basra and the Russians attacked in the Caucasus. Their Bergman offensive failed, and Ottoman War Minister Enver Pasha ordered an ambitious counteroffensive in December. About 100,000 Ottoman troops set out into the Allahu Akbar mountains to execute a complex battle plan. But the campaign quickly turned into a deadly disaster. Conditions in the mountains were extremely cold, and badly equipped Ottoman units were caught up in fierce snowstorms. Tens of thousands froze to death, the Russian defenses held firm thanks to superior artillery, and the surviving Ottomans retreated into Anatolia in January after suffering up to 65% casualties. There was fighting across the globe as well. Japan joined the Allies to fulfill its alliance with Britain, but also to expand its own empire at German expense. Japanese troops besieged the German colony in China at Tsingtao, taking it after a 3-month siege. In Africa, British, French, and German colonial forces battled in the west, south, and east. And on the high seas, the British and German navies clashed in deadly but indecisive smaller battles, leaving Britain in control of the oceans, but the main German fleet intact. So after months of bloody fighting, multiple fronts ended in stalemate and the armies dug in, usually by using systems of trenches. But it was on the Western Front that 1914 saw the introduction of modern trench warfare on a massive scale. Now, trenches were not unknown before 1914. In fact, they'd been used since antiquity, and even more in more recent conflicts like the Crimean War, US Civil War, Boer War, and the Russo-Japanese War. But the network of trenches that the French, British, and German armies dug in 1914 was unprecedented in its scale, complexity, and resistance to attacking forces. Once the initial war plans failed, both sides tried to outflank the other in what became misleadingly known as the Race to the Sea. But even as the armies were sending forces further north, the front lines began to harden. By October 1914, a network of trenches stretched nearly unbroken from the Swiss border to the English Channel, a front line that would only deepen over the next 3 years. Mobile warfare lasted just 3 months in 1914, to be replaced by trench warfare once these grand offensives failed. Why they failed and why new offensives had little chance to break the deadlock explains why trench warfare began. The arms industry had developed deadly new technologies in the years leading up to 1914, and when these new weapons were used on a mass scale for the first time, the results were devastating. So devastating that they helped force entire armies to take shelter in trenches. The weapons of 1914 made the open battlefield far more deadly than the last European great power wars in 1870 or 1866. The deadliest weapon of all was artillery. The French 75mm gun was considered the best field gun in the world, and rightly so. Thanks to its hydraulic brake system, it could fire in bursts of 15 to 30 rounds per minute for a limited time, as opposed to about 5 rounds per minute for the Prussian C-64 field gun of 1870. 1914 field guns had ranges of 7 to 11,000 meters, far beyond the 3,500 meters of 1870. And the Germans especially had heavy artillery that could fire even heavier shells even farther. The shells these modern guns fired were also more powerful than in previous wars, thanks to advances in chemical explosives like melinite. Small arms had also become more deadly. British Lee Enfield, German Mauser, and French Lebel rifles all had superior ranges and rates of fire thanks to smokeless powder and multi-round clips, up to 15 rounds a minute per rifle. Modern machine guns like the Maxim, Vickers, Hotchkiss, and Saint-Étienne could fire 500 bullets every minute, 5 times as many as the multi-barreled mitrailleuse of 1870. Military experts knew of these developments before the war, though. They observed them on a smaller scale, like in the Russo-Japanese War, and noted it in their field manuals. Bullets can still kill a man at 2,000 meters. At ordinary ranges, they go through several men. What the generals were not sure of was how this would influence fighting. Would it help attackers or defenders? A few theorists thought it might lead to a defensive stalemate, while others, especially in France, felt that a vigorous attacking spirit would prevail, as it had for the Japanese in some battles in 1904-05. French Captain Billard was a supporter of the attacking spirit in 1913. War is not so much about capability as it is about courage. Science will always yield to devotion and firmness. Above all else, every trooper must be inculcated with this spirit of ultimate sacrifice, which will later reveal itself in the offensive. However, events in August and September showed the new weapons made attacking in the open a deadly business, as French officer Charles de Gaulle experienced firsthand. Suddenly, the enemy's fire became precise and concentrated. Second by second, the hail of bullets and the thunder of the shells grew stronger. Those who survived lay flat on the ground, amid the screaming wounded and the humble corpses. In an instant, it had become clear that not all the courage in the world could withstand this fire. While the armies fought in the open, men died in droves. After just 5 months of fighting in the West, France had lost 265,000 dead, Germany at least 85,000, and Britain about 30,000 from its much smaller army. And most of these were lost in August and September, before trench warfare began. These losses were proportionally heavier than any other year of the war, and they were unsustainable. The only escape was the relative safety of the trenches, as French officer Pierre Dupuy observed. The fire of the German heavy guns is admirably precise and well regulated. The other day I saw 6 shell craters in a 30-meter diameter circle, and these shells came from more than 7,000 meters away. But however accurate their fire, a trench gives shelter untouchable by artillery. Well-dug-in infantry can only be dislodged by infantry, and properly by enemy bayonets. Another problem that ended mobile warfare and ensured trench warfare would be around for the long haul was how to actually fight. Given the superiority of defensive firepower and the early trench systems, armies struggled to sustain any kind of success with infantry or artillery, and especially coordinating the two. Gunners had a hard time fighting in unfamiliar situations. In mobile war, they often fired against visible targets, but in set-piece battles and when faced with trench systems, crews found themselves attempting to hit targets at ranges greater than they had trained for and with indirect fire. This required much more information, which, in 1914, was difficult, given the problems in command and control. Aerial reconnaissance helped, but aircraft were still rare, and crews could move, camouflage, and dig in to hide their guns from prying eyes. As for the infantry, assaulting an entrenched enemy was risky business, and mistakes often occurred. Regulations did foresee tactics that took into account enemy firepower, like moving forward in shorter bursts and with smaller groups. But officers often had difficulty coordinating their troops, and assaults often took place in denser formations, which then withered under defensive firepower. The Germans made this mistake at Ypres in October, as British Captain Henry Dillon witnessed. A great grey mass of humanity was charging, running for all God would let them, straight onto us, not 50 yards off. I have never shot so much in such a short time, and it could not have been more than a few seconds, and they were down. But perhaps the main challenge was coordinating the two main combat arms in a way that would ensure artillery support arrived at the right place at the right time to help infantry attack through enemy trenches. There weren't enough liaison officers to communicate the needs of the infantry to the nearest batteries, and overly eager infantry officers didn't always wait for support before launching an attack. French Captain Alphonse Grasset recalled the suffering of his men in the absence of artillery support. My company was sustaining heavy losses. Evidently, its action was hampering the enemy, who concentrated the combined fire of his infantry, artillery, and machine guns on us. Among the men lying on the ground, one could no longer distinguish the living from the dead. We had no support from our artillery, and yet there were guns in our division and in the Army Corps, besides those destroyed on the road. Where were they? Why didn't they arrive? We were alone. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre even put out an explicit warning to his infantry officers not to attack without artillery support, after he received reports of units doing just that. He chalked it up to a misunderstanding of the doctrine of the offensive, though lack of training played a key role too. Another factor that enabled trench warfare was the problem of command and control. The armies that took the field were larger than ever before. Once mobilized, the German army numbered about 2.3 million men and the French 2.9 million. How such vast armies would receive and act on orders in a timely manner, and whether the commanders could manage such masses of men, had caused many doubts among military thinkers before the war. And indeed, commanders did struggle to direct their armies, in particular the Germans, who needed to move the farthest, the fastest. First and Second Armies lost touch on the right wing, and von Moltke ended up accepting First Army's swing to the east after the fact, rather than approving or countermanding the order quickly. Joffre admitted that many generals simply couldn't handle his troops well enough, and relieved scores of generals in fall 1914. Part of the problem was that the technology to quickly communicate orders over long distances to massive moving formations wasn't equal to the task. There weren't enough telephone lines or telephones, and what equipment was available was often cut by shelling. French General Gascoigne was among those frustrated by the shortages. A few kilometers more of telephone wire would have been worth more to me than all the blathering on about combined arms and the unity of hearts between infantrymen and gunners. Wireless telegraphy was still primitive, and voice radio was not effective until after the war. French intelligence was able to intercept German messages sent by wireless en clair without code, by German units desperate for orders, ammunition, reinforcements, or to find out where their neighbors were. The Allies also suffered from difficulties communicating, as liaison officers were few and far between. British General Horace Smith-Dorrien was left completely in the dark about the whereabouts of neighboring French forces near Mons in August. I'd been given no information of the somewhat serious happenings in the French army on our right, which I learned years later, namely that it had been forced back, and was already some 9 miles south of Mons, with a gap of at least 9 miles between the right of our 2nd Corps and the left of the French 18th Corps, thus leaving us in a very vulnerable, indefensible, and salient position. Communication was often reduced to mounted messengers relaying notes to headquarters or the nearest working telegraph or telephone station, not an effective enough system to implement complex war plans. Historian Larry Addington summed up the dilemma. Like the fictional Dr. Frankenstein, the general staffs of Europe had created monsters that they could scarcely control, and whose movements at a distance were difficult to gauge. Mobility and logistics were another issue. The only way for the infantry to move forward was on foot, and the artillery could only move with horses, which could only be worked so hard and were extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. Simultaneously, the defender, who was operating within his own lines, was able to reinforce the threatened area much more quickly by taking advantage of the roads and rail networks in his own rear. The essence of the problem was that the attackers' poor tactical mobility could not overcome the defenders' greater operational and strategic mobility. Another reason why mobile warfare was replaced by trench warfare in 1914 were supply problems. Attacking armies struggled to supply themselves with food, fodder, ammunition, and reinforcements, while defending armies could do so much more easily. The key aspect here is the railway. As soon as a formation moved forward into enemy-held territory, it began to move farther from its own railheads. Since armies were not yet motorized, that meant the main body of the attackers moved only as fast as a marching infantryman, and their supplies only as fast as a horse-drawn wagon. The defender, though, could shift his forces and supplies much faster by rail. This problem helped cripple the German Schlieffen Plan, since the plan demanded more than was humanly possible of undersupplied troops. German soldier Wilhelm Heigl described the hardships. Day after day we have to march, and there's not a lot of time to rest. In the last couple of days, we've marched nearly 80 kilometers. We heard that a comrade in the 6th Company has shot himself because he could not bear it anymore. You can't imagine what we have to go through. German troops marched 30 to 40 kilometers a day with 26-kilogram packs and received inadequate resupply and reinforcement, forcing them to scavenge for vegetables in French fields. The vital heavy artillery also fell behind the infantry it was meant to support. This issue was made worse by delays in taking over captured French and Belgian railway lines. Meanwhile, French defenders used their shorter interior lines to quickly shift troops around, most notably at the Marne in September 1914. When the race to the sea began, the same transport issues prevented the Germans from getting enough troops around the Allied flanks, and the fighting hardened into positional warfare there as well. Another logistical issue was shell production. The general staffs had not anticipated such a heavy rate of fire for the artillery in pre-war planning, and the guns fired much of the existing shell stocks by September. This contributed to the start of trench warfare because the armies simply didn't have enough shells to attack early trench networks with the necessary weight of fire. French state factories, for example, could only produce 10,000 shells a day in 1914, far too little for their 3,500 guns in the field. The situation was so critical that Joffre demanded daily reports of shells fired and placed strict limits on shells per gun per day. German pre-war stocks had also been used up within the first 6 weeks, when they'd been expected to last 6 months. So by fall 1914, trench warfare dominated on the Western Front. The initial plans for decisive mobile war failed, and attempts to break through the very first trenches also failed because armies faced insurmountable problems. Lethal firepower that favored the defender, inadequate infantry, artillery, and combined arms tactics, deficiencies in command and control, and logistical shortcomings. The result was that from August to October 1914, that now famous network of trenches crept from around Nancy to Verdun, along the Aisne, and finally through Belgium to the sea. These defenses defeated every attempt to break them, whether by the Allies on the Aisne and in Champagne, or by the Germans at Ypres. German soldier Paul Hube complained about the impossibility of breaching British trenches in Belgium. The terrible digging continues. Every day brings new horrors. It's impossible to get rid of those Englishmen. They've dug one trench behind another. Ironically, the trenches were not meant to be permanent. Commanders hoped that entrenching would buy time and free up forces to launch new offensives that would return to mobile war. A British officer in Belgium expressed this desire in November. "I'm getting awfully bored by the trenches, and I'm feeling fearfully tired. I hope we won't be in them much longer. I wish they would order the advance." The war began in July 1914 as a regional conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. But just a few months later, the great powers and their global empires were locked in a titanic bloodbath with no end in sight. By the end of the year, Germany had suffered about 800,000 casualties, Austria-Hungary 1.2 million, the Ottomans 80,000, Britain 90,000, Belgium 50,000, Serbia 170,000, France 530,000, and Russia 1.8 million. The hopes of a decisive war over by Christmas were gone. Mass armies and modern firepower had resulted in exhausted stalemate in the east and trench gridlock in the west. War was totalizing, in the media, the factories, and on the battlefield. Hundreds of thousands had been killed and millions displaced, and yet all the powers still believed victory was possible. But the worst was yet to come. Since you're watching this massive documentary about the pivotal year 1914 and the First World War, I'm guessing you might be a fan of detailed military history documentaries. If you're interested in the final offensives of the Second World War in Europe, we produced 2 epic World War II documentaries about them. The first is 16 Days in Berlin, the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin ever produced. A 4.5-hour, day-by-day breakdown of one of the biggest battles of the entire war, when the Red Army advanced from the Oder River into the heart of Nazi Germany's capital. The second is a 3.5-hour documentary called Rhineland 45, about the last set-piece battle on the Western Front in which the Allies under Bernard Montgomery attacked from the Dutch border and ultimately crossed the mighty Rhine River. Both documentaries were filmed on original location, featured detailed maps and animations, expert and veteran interviews, and more. But you can't watch 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45 on YouTube because of our uncompromising portrayal of the war using authentic combat footage. If you want even more history content on Nebula, check out Epic History TV and their incredible coverage of the Napoleonic Wars. Or, if you really want to support us and the idea behind Nebula, right now you can get the Nebula Lifetime membership, which allows us and Nebula to invest more into original documentaries that we couldn't produce on YouTube, to further improve Nebula and bring it to even more platforms. Again, that's nebula.tv/realtimehistory for a great deal that also supports us at Realtime History directly. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel that wants you to know that in the present circumstances, no failure will be tolerated.